Hey guys, tonight we begin with something much darker. A time of ravens, blood, and dying gods. We're diving into what life was really like during the height of the Viking Age. Forget the horned helmets and noble warriors Hollywood sold you. The truth is, if you were captured during a Viking raid, you probably wouldn't just die. You'd become art, carved from living flesh for the entertainment of Norse gods who demand beauty in suffering. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those whose ancestors might have witnessed these very rituals. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. This isn't your typical historical tour. Tonight, we're taking you on the most brutal experience in medieval Scandinavia. For the next 2 hours, we'll experience capture during a Viking raid, witness the Blood Eagle ceremony, and understand what it meant to live in a world where death was art, and your screams were prayers to gods who fed on human suffering. At the 10-minute mark, your screen will automatically turn black. This isn't just to save battery, but has deep scientific basis. Blue light from phone screens suppresses the production of melatonin, your body's natural sleep-regulating hormone. Research from Harvard University shows that exposure to blue light before sleep can disrupt your circadian rhythm and make falling into deep sleep much more difficult. The next 6 hours will be a continuous flow of white noise, specially designed for those with insomnia, for those restless minds that refuse to sleep. This audio is crafted for anxious thoughts, racing hearts, and minds that just won't quiet down. It's optimized at 40-60 Hz frequencies, a range that neuroscience research proves helps slow brain waves and promote deep sleep for even the most troubled sleepers. Tonight, we're following you, a Saxon monk captured during a Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, when longships brought death from the sea and your monastery became a feast for ravens. We'll experience the terror of capture, the journey to a foreign land where your god has no power, and the slow realization that your death will be transformed into religious art for gods who appreciate human creativity applied to human destruction. This journey will take us through burning monasteries where books become kindling, slave markets where humans are currency, and sacred groves where trees are decorated with human entrails. We'll witness the elaborate preparations for the Blood Eagle, the ritual significance of transforming human backs into wings, and the religious meaning behind suffering that creates beauty for gods who judge artistic merit through screaming. You'll experience what it felt like to be chosen for the most honored death in Norse culture, to have your spine carved into eagle wings while you're still alive to appreciate the artistry, to become a living sacrifice whose suffering feeds the war god Odin and ensures Viking victory in future raids. We'll explore how an entire culture organized itself around death as art, how human sacrifice became performance that required skill, creativity, and religious devotion from executioners who were simultaneously artists, priests, and craftsmen working with human flesh as their medium. But this isn't just about death and torture. We'll delve into the psychology of living in a warrior culture where dying well was more important than living comfortably, where your death could bring honor to your family or shame, depending on how artistically you were killed, where gods judged humans by their willingness to suffer beautifully. This is dark tourism at its most extreme. We're not just visiting sites where people died. We're experiencing the ritualized transformation of human death into religious art that served cosmic purposes requiring human creativity applied to human destruction in ways that pleased gods who appreciated both beauty and suffering. So prepare yourself for a journey that will take you from peaceful English monasteries to Norse ritual sites where human backs become wings, from Christian prayers to pagan ceremonies where your screams become sacred music for gods who demand both artistry and agony from human sacrifice. Welcome to the most artistically brutal civilization in European history. Tonight, We don't just explore Viking culture. We become Viking art, carved from living flesh for the entertainment of gods who judge human worth through human willingness to be transformed into beautiful death.
She texted Amber first, no reply. Then Eli. His response came hours later and was short. "It's messy right now." She stared at the screen, thumb hovering, unsure if she should write back or just delete it. By evening, she knew. The silence wasn't by accident. It was coordinated. Eli's brother played varsity football. Amber's mum was on the PTA. Neither of them wanted to be tied to someone who had become a hashtag for all the wrong reasons. In the cafeteria group chat, messages had been deleted. Her name removed from the prom planning spreadsheet. She opened the school news app and saw a notice about the upcoming student protest against behavioral disruptions. No one had asked her to join. The protest wasn't about her. It was against her. That night, her mother received a call, not from the school, but from the local police department. Tiana had been listed as part of an unofficial student activist circle accused of organizing school walkouts. Her mother's voice cracked as she tried to explain, but the officer insisted on a meeting to clarify intent and record testimony. Tiana was 16. No lawyer, no charges, just pressure. It wasn't legal, not fully, but it was enough to rattle them. Her father wasn't home. He had flown to DC for a hearing he couldn't cancel. When she told him over the phone, he didn't. Breathe for 5 seconds. Then he said, "Say nothing until I'm back." The next day, she was brought to the precinct. No handcuffs. Just a cold waiting room and a clipboard, with questions she wasn't required to answer, but was still asked to. The officer, a woman in her 30s with a practiced smile, leaned close and said, "You don't want this to go on your record, do you?" Tiana didn't answer. She watched the fluorescent lights flicker above her head, each pulse a quiet reminder that silence didn't mean safety. Across town, her friend Amber stood in front of a classroom, rehearsing a speech about leadership and community values, wearing a blazer her mother had ironed that morning. Tiana sat in an interrogation room, her school bag searched without consent, her rights not fully read, and her future marked with invisible ink. The clip appeared late Friday night. It wasn't edited, wasn't flashy, just a steady, shaky recording from the back of the classroom. The person filming had stayed silent for days, maybe afraid, maybe waiting. But the truth had a sound, and in this case, it was the unmistakable voice of Ms. Kellerman. The video showed everything. Tiana standing at the front of the room, not speaking, not moving. Then the principal stepping in, raising his voice, calling security, and using words the district had denied he ever said. Get her out before this spreads. Not for disruption, not for behavior, but for being a problem they wanted gone before anyone noticed. The video hit social media fast, faster than the school could react. It was raw and damning. Within an hour, local activists reposted it. National accounts followed. Hashtags flipped. The silence that once smothered Tiana cracked, and in its place came noise, real noise. People started asking questions the school didn't want to answer. The same outlets that ran stories painting her as unruly now rushed to cover the leaked footage. But the school wasn't done. They doubled down. Principal Hargrove issued a counter-statement claiming the video was misleading, taken out of context, and part of a smear campaign. They called in a lawyer. The district board backed him publicly. A new narrative was pushed, one that said the video was planted by radical groups seeking to discredit educators. Tiana watched all of it from the living room floor. Her father said nothing, just played the video once more, eyes locked on the moment when she was told to leave, and never looked back. He picked up his phone, called his attorney, and said 5 words. "It's time we go louder." Meanwhile, Ms. Kellerman went silent. No interviews, no appearances. But the story had already shifted. The truth was out. Still, they were preparing for the next strike. Tiana knew it. Her name had become a symbol, but not everyone wanted that symbol to stand. And behind closed doors, the school was planning its next move. More desperate, more dangerous. They weren't finished. They never stopped at just once. The room smelled like old carpet and filtered coffee. 7 people sat behind a long table, all dressed in navy blazers and stiff expressions. Tiana walked in with her back straight and eyes forward, but her hands trembled slightly beneath the cuffs of her sweater. The district's internal review board had called for a closed-door hearing, citing the need to maintain order while evaluating her alleged violations. No press, no family, just her, 1 chair, and a voice recorder on the table. The principal was already seated, flanked by the assistant superintendent and 2 legal representatives. No one offered a greeting. A woman with silver-rimmed glasses leaned into her mic and said, "Miss James, please explain the intent behind your behavior on March 2nd. Tiana blinked. "What behavior?" Another board member raised his voice. "Raising your tone, refusing to leave, instigating conflict." She inhaled slowly and replied, "I never raised my voice. I never refused to leave. I was told to go without reason." The room paused. Then someone slid a folder forward. Inside were printed screenshots of online posts, most not even hers, but tagged with her name. They used digital noise to manufacture intent. "Do you believe your appearance aligns with our district's standard of excellence?" One man asked, his tone sharp but rehearsed. Tiana's jaw clenched. She said nothing. That silence was treated as defiance. "Your kind always has something to protest," one board member mumbled, not realizing his mic was still live. The room stiffened. No one corrected him. No one apologized. Tiana sat motionless. Outside, her father stood in the hallway, not in his suit, not speaking, just waiting. He wasn't allowed in, not yet. Inside, the vote came fast. The recommendation was to suspend her for the remainder of the semester pending review. No official charge, no due process, just removal, neatly signed. As they stood to leave, one member said, "Let's handle this quietly. We can't let this go viral again." Tiana rose, turned to the door, and opened it slowly. Her father looked up. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. His eyes already knew. And for the first time, he stepped into the frame. He didn't wear the senator pin. No cameras followed him. No headlines announced his presence. He sat quietly in the back row of the hearing room, a notebook on his lap, and his daughter's silence echoing in his ears. For 40 minutes he said nothing. He watched them dissect her reputation with graphs and policy references. He watched them ignore the video that showed the truth. He watched them erase his daughter with paperwork. When the vote was cast and the room began to clear, he stood. Not with force, not with anger, just purpose. The members froze. They knew his face. Some had shaken his hand at ribbon cuttings. One had donated to his campaign. He walked to the front without being invited. A security officer took a step forward but then stopped, unsure. The senator placed his notebook on the table and opened it. Inside were letters, statements, sworn records from staff who had remained quiet, a transcript of the now viral video, a summary of state education statutes on student rights. He said calmly, "We have not filed suit yet, but if this process continues behind closed doors without legal counsel or press transparency, we will." The room fell silent. One board member whispered, "This is highly irregular." He replied, "So is expelling a child without cause and then lying about it." His voice didn't rise, but it filled the space. He turned to his daughter. She hadn't moved. Her hands were still in her lap. He looked back at the board and said, "This is no longer just about her. It's about every student who has been labeled instead of listened to, every parent who wasn't called, every file marked with suspicion instead of truth." Then he reached into his coat and placed his credentials on the table. "Let's make this public," he said. The board members stared at the seal, the weight of it undeniable. No one spoke. Outside the room, a local journalist waited, already tipped off. This time the silence belonged to them. Amira didn't leave the shelter for 3 days. She barely spoke. Her phone was gone, her apartment gone, her daughter gone. And yet she didn't fall. She wrote by hand on yellow legal pads, line after line, detailing every interaction, every lie, every false charge and betrayal. She had memorized dates and names. She created timelines from memory. In the early mornings, she sat by the vending machine with a cup of instant coffee and studied municipal code like it was scripture. Her breath became steady. Her hands no longer shook. She began mailing physical copies of her findings to law, clinics, advocacy centers, and independent journalists across the country. She didn't trust email anymore. She didn't trust phones. She didn't even trust walls. She started attending public meetings at City Hall, sitting in the back taking notes. She never spoke. She just watched. When a speaker mentioned the rising cost of public defense, Amira quietly filed a request to access budget reports. When the sheriff bragged about crime reduction, she compared his claim against arrest records for nonviolent offenses and found a disturbing pattern. She was building something, alone, quietly. One afternoon, while standing in line at the courthouse to request another set of documents, a man in a dark blue coat brushed past her. He didn't look at her. He didn't stop. But as he passed, he slid a small folded paper into her palm. It had no name, just a message. Do not give up yet. She looked up, but he was gone. That night, she walked back to the shelter with her shoulders squared. She didn't know who he was. Maybe a city clerk, maybe a guard, maybe someone who still believed in law, but it didn't matter. The system had tried to strip her of voice, housing, child, dignity. But it couldn't touch the things she had kept, hidden the longest, her memory and her plan. Amira stayed quiet. She stayed small. But she was setting a fuse. And the people who thought she was finished hadn't realized yet that silence was just the start of her fire. It began with a setup so sloppy it almost made Amira laugh. She had just exited the library with a stack of printed foyer requests in her bag when she noticed 2 squad cars idling across the street. She ignored them. She had become used to the constant presence of eyes and engines. But when she reached her temporary mailbox at the UPS store, the key jammed. A store clerk helped her. Inside the box was a thick envelope, no sender, no return address, only her name typed in block letters. She opened it on the sidewalk. It was a search warrant. Not real, fabricated, signed by a judge who had retired 2 years earlier. And at that exact moment, the officers across the street pulled forward and surrounded her. They claimed she had an unregistered weapon in her bag. She told them to check. They did. They found nothing. But when she demanded a supervisor, one of the officers stepped close and whispered, "Try again and you won't see your kid." She stood still. Her voice didn't shake. She asked clearly and calmly if they were wearing body cams. They said yes. She already knew one of them had turned his off. But what they didn't know was that the building across the street had security, cameras on every corner. The entire incident had been caught from 4 angles. 2 hours later, the footage was uploaded anonymously. It showed the officers planting the envelope. It showed the fabricated warrant. It showed everything. And for the first time, the city couldn't bury it. But that wasn't the twist. That came later when a press conference was suddenly called at City Hall. Cameras rolled, reporters leaned in, and standing behind the podium wasn't a lawyer, or a protester or a stranger. It was him, the mayor, her husband. The man who had vanished from her public life nearly a decade ago, kept hidden by mutual agreement for political safety, for her peace, for their daughter's anonymity. He stepped to the microphone and said nothing for a moment. Then he raised the printed image from the footage, her face, her fear, her silence, and he said, "That is the mother of my child, and what this department did to her is what they have done to so many who do not have a voice like mine." The room froze. Reporters dropped their pens. Some whispered, some filmed. He continued, "The city I swore to lead just showed me what it looks like in the dark, and I'm telling you now, I will burn the whole department to the ground if that is what justice requires." He didn't blink, he didn't flinch. And somewhere, watching the live stream from the shelter stairwell, Amira closed her eyes and let herself exhale. The silence had finally been broken by the one voice no one saw coming. By the next morning, the city had changed. Overnight, the mayor had ordered an immediate independent audit of the entire police department and frozen all pending prosecutions involving public nuisance and resisting arrest charges filed in the last 18 months. A special commission was assembled, and Amira was invited to testify. She arrived wearing a plain black blazer, her hair pulled back, her words precise. She spoke not only of her own experience, but of the patterns she had uncovered, the files she had tracked, the sealed records of others whose stories had been silenced before hers. Each sentence landed like a slow-moving hammer. Behind her, stacks of documents and video footage played on a screen. Names, faces, case numbers. Callan sat 3 rows behind her, arms crossed, his jaw locked. He had come to observe, not to speak, but everyone felt his presence like smoke in a sealed room. Amira did not look at him. She focused on the panel. Her voice never rose. She listed dates, laws violated, budgets manipulated, and arrests misreported. Then she sat down. The commission chair, a federal judge from out of state, took a long pause before saying, "This is no longer a personnel matter. This is systemic." Hours later, the Department of Justice confirmed a full-scale investigation. Officer Callan was placed on administrative leave, but that status didn't last long. Whistleblowers within the precinct began stepping forward. a deputy leaked an internal memo showing deliberate efforts to alter arrest data to meet quotas. Another revealed text messages where officers mocked Amira and planned how to intimidate her further. Then came the voice recordings. One included Callan boasting in the locker room about how she was too smart for her own good and that someone had to remind her who runs the streets. Meanwhile, Jenna was quietly dismissed from her school leadership role after the school board received copies of her communication with the department. Her name was never mentioned publicly, but her office door was locked by the end of the week. The mayor, under public pressure, and with a rising coalition behind him, issued a citywide address stating that all city contracts with the current police union would be reviewed and that a civilian oversight board would be established. For the first time in the city's history, people gathered in front of City Hall not in protest, but in stunned attention. They held candles, photos of past victims, posters of Amira with the word resilient printed across the bottom. But Amira wasn't in the crowd. She was inside in a quiet room, reviewing the next round of affidavits, because for her this wasn't a victory. It was a beginning. Justice wasn't a speech. It was a structure. And she was learning how to rebuild it brick by brick. The morning after the mayor's speech, a box was left outside the shelter. It had no label, no return address, just Amira's name written in permanent marker across the top. Inside were newspaper clippings soaked in red ink, a broken pair of child-sized glasses and a dead bird. It wasn't a warning, it was a declaration. The shelter director insisted she relocate for her own safety. They moved her overnight to an undisclosed church rectory 2 towns away. She slept in a small room with a stained glass window that cast blue light across the floor in the early hours. But peace didn't follow her. Emails began flooding in from fake addresses, death threats, accusations, manipulated photos of her face attached to crime scenes she had never seen. Her name was twisted into hashtags filled with lies. Podcasts accused her of being an operative. Forums claimed she had been planted by political enemies. Her face appeared on television news with talking heads questioning her motives. Why now? Why her? Why this city? But Amira said nothing, not because she was afraid, because she was focused. Her daughter, Nia, had been relocated with emergency foster guardianship out of state. She received updates through a lawyer she trusted. The last note said Nia asked if she could bring her stuffed rabbit home when she came back. Amira read that sentence over and over until her eyes blurred. The cost of truth was now measured in distance, in absence, in how many nights her daughter went to sleep without her. But then, in the middle of this hurricane, a break appeared. A plain envelope slid under her temporary door. Inside was a flash, drive and a sticky note with one line, "He said it himself." Amira opened the files on a secure offline laptop. The audio was clear. Officer Callan, drunk, bragging in a private gathering recorded by someone he trusted too much. He described how he had orchestrated her second arrest, bragged about planting false records, laughed about how she looked like she believed in due process. At the end of the file, someone asked, "What if it comes back to you?" Callan replied, "It won't, I'm protected." The next morning, Amira met with a federal agent. She handed over the flash drive and the chain of correspondence that led to her receiving it. No words were needed. The agent listened, nodded, and left. Hours later, Callan was suspended without pay, and a federal grand jury was called. As she stood alone in that rectory hallway, she looked up at the stained glass and whispered to herself, not a prayer but a reminder. The truth will cost you everything, but silence costs more. And if they were going to try and bury her again, they would have to do it beneath the very evidence they helped her collect. The courthouse was packed before sunrise. Journalists clustered by the front steps with cameras ready. Inside, the gallery overflowed. Court officers directed people to wait in the hallway, where a live audio feed played through wall-mounted speakers. It wasn't just a trial, it was an autopsy of power. Amira entered through a side entrance with 2 federal escorts and sat, quietly near the front, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only a dark suit and a steel stillness that filled the room more than any opening statement. Callan sat across from her at the defendant's table, his Face locked in forced composure, jaw tense, lips barely moving. His lawyers spoke first, painting a picture of a man overwhelmed by pressure, a servant of the law caught in political winds. They blamed protocol, stress, administrative failure. They called him committed. They called him consistent. They called him misunderstood. But Amira had brought the facts, and the facts spoke louder than their spin. When it was her turn to testify, she stood without fanfare and approached the stand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't tremble. She told the story. Each moment, each humiliation, each manipulation. She gave dates, names, audio logs, and finally, the flash drive. The judge allowed the clip to be played. The courtroom fell silent as Callan's own voice echoed through the speakers, drunk and smug, describing how he had her file doctored, how he had planted the story, how she would never recover. In the back row, one juror flinched. At the prosecution's request, Amira was allowed to read a final statement before stepping down. She looked at Callan only once and said, "You did not fail because the system broke you. You failed because the system made you comfortable." Then she returned to her seat. The judge called for a recess. The hallway filled with whispers. Reporters scrambled for sound bites. But inside the courtroom, the tension became air, and when the jury returned the verdict hours later, the entire building held its breath. Guilty on all charges. Callan did not react. He blinked once and stared ahead. The judge postponed sentencing, but the damage was already done, not just to him, to the city, to the badge, to the story that had hidden behind uniforms and paperwork for far too long. Amira remained seated as the room emptied. One by one, people walked out in silence, as if they had just witnessed not a trial but a shift in gravity. And for the first time since it began, Amira closed her eyes and let herself feel nothing. Because the fight had never been about a courtroom. It had been about being heard, and now the whole country was listening. The sentencing hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. But by then, the courtroom had become irrelevant. The real sentence had already been handed down in public. The mayor issued an executive order dissolving the current leadership of the police department effective immediately. Every badge in the building was recalled for audit. Every desk was subject to review. Internal Affairs launched a parallel investigation into 21 active duty officers with ties to the cover-ups exposed through Amira's testimony. Civil lawsuits flooded in from former victims who had never been believed before. The city's legal team resigned. The union threatened to strike. But the strike never happened. No one was willing to defend the foundation once it cracked. News outlets ran the audio from the trial in full. Local papers replaced political endorsements with printed apologies. The governor released a statement calling the events a national wake-up call and promised oversight legislation that should have existed decades ago. At the center of it all stood Amira. She declined all interview requests. She refused to appear on television. She spoke only once on the steps of the courthouse where it had all begun. She faced the crowd, the cameras, and said, "They erased my name, so I made them remember it." That sentence became a mural painted across the side of her former elementary school. Below it, children traced the letters with their fingers. That afternoon, Officer Callan was led out of the courthouse in cuffs. His eyes were blank. His voice was gone. No words, no rage, only silence. The same silence he had once weaponized was now his sentence. Jenna's resignation went unannounced, but her office was emptied in under an hour. She left behind a desk, drawer filled with printed lesson plans, and a photograph of her and Amira at a staff retreat, now bent at the edges. Amira did not call her. She did not need to. The system had spoken for her. That week, Amira visited her daughter. Nia ran across the grass with her stuffed rabbit in hand and said nothing, just wrapped her arms around her waist and refused to let go. The sun felt different, not brighter, just real. They sat on a bench for hours without speaking. No cameras, no speeches, no permission needed. Later that night, Amira returned to her quiet room and opened a new folder on her laptop. It had no title, just a blank document. She began typing a new story, not hers, someone else's. A woman in a different city, a man with no badge, a system built on silence. She had burned one structure to the ground. But there were others. And now, she knew how to write the first match. 1 month later, the city had settled into a new rhythm, quieter, slower, filled with the cautious hush of a place learning to breathe again. People no longer crossed the street when they saw uniformed officers, because there were no uniforms, left to fear. The department had been stripped to its bones, its foundation erased by executive order. A transitional oversight committee was appointed, staffed by independent civil rights attorneys and community organizers. The old flags were taken down. The building was renamed. On the outside it looked like healing. On the inside it felt like something deeper. The day the announcement was made that the entire department had been officially disbanded, Amira was not at City Hall. She was standing in the back of a second-grade classroom, watching her daughter draw a house with a sun so large it touched both corners of the paper. The teacher welcomed her without hesitation. Other parents offered tired smiles, but no one said anything about the trial, the video, the scandal. For the first time in months, she was not Amira Davis, the woman who stood against the police. She was just Nia's mother. And yet, the world around her remembered. On the sidewalk outside the courthouse, someone had laid a wreath of white carnations with a note that read, "Justice wears curls." That night, candles lit the street where she had once been thrown onto her own car. Strangers stood in silence, holding hands, saying nothing. In a nearby playground, a mural had appeared without notice. It showed a black woman standing tall. Her face firm, her arms open, behind her a crumbling wall of old police badges. And at the bottom of the wall, children played. There were no speeches that day, no hashtags, no trending topics, just a shift. Like gravity had changed. People no longer whispered about justice. They walked inside it. Amira passed a woman who stopped and said thank you, not loudly, not for credit, just enough for both of them to hear. Amira nodded. She kept walking, because she knew something. No headline had printed. This wasn't the end, it wasn't even the full cost, it was just the receipt. And they hadn't seen the last page. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't claim victory. The story ended the way real ones often do, without applause, without closing credits, just a long exhale after too many months of holding her breath. Amira took her daughter home. They painted the walls a pale green. They planted lavender on the windowsill. They laughed at cartoons that had nothing to do with justice. And every morning, Amira brewed her coffee in silence, listening not for sirens but for stillness. She didn't watch the news. She didn't check her mentions. She returned to teaching part-time at a community center where no one called her. Brave just teacher. The scars she carried weren't visible, but they spoke every time someone tried to erase a name. One day, a young woman approached her after class and asked if the system had really changed. Amira didn't answer right away. She walked the girl to the end of the block, past the mural, past the courthouse, past the city that had tried to erase her. Then she turned and said, "Systems don't change, people do, and sometimes that's enough to make the system crack." The girl nodded and walked away. Amira stayed, her eyes on the courthouse steps where it all began. She didn't need revenge. She had something quieter, something louder, a question. And it lived in every street that no longer feared uniforms, every mother who refused to lower her voice, every child who now believed their silence could be a weapon if they aimed it right. So she asked it silently, not to the system, but to the world watching. What would you do if your silence was more dangerous than your voice? Then she turned around, picked up her daughter's backpack and walked home.